In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the universe's beginning and creation. Many people see these as the same thing. Some religious people therefore think that if the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, that in itself proves that it was created and that God exists. And conversely, some atheists think that if physics could somehow show that the universe had no beginning but existed for infinite time, it would prove that there was no creation. As I'll explain, however, the universe having a beginning in time and its being created by God are distinct ideas. And while physics may be able to tell us whether the universe had a beginning, it cannot tell us whether it is created. At this point, some may suspect that in distinguishing between beginning and creation, I'm putting forward some new or radical theological idea. But in fact, it is completely traditional. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas also made this distinction. You can see this from the fact that he believed the creation of the universe can be proved philosophically, whereas he did not think that the universe having a beginning can be proved. He said that it was within God's power to create either a universe that has a temporal beginning or one that has an infinite past. And the fact that he chose to create one that has a beginning is something we only know because God revealed it to us in Scripture. This may come as a surprise to people who have heard of St. Thomas's first mover argument for the existence of God. They think St. Thomas was arguing that a chain of events cannot go back infinitely into the past, but must have commenced with a first event. But philosophers know that is not what he had in mind. In fact, St. Thomas explicitly said that he saw no philosophical reason why there couldn't be a chain of events extending infinitely into the past, such as a man being begotten by his father, who was in turn begotten by his father, and so on ad infinitum. St. Thomas's first mover argument was not about chains of events, but was more subtle, though I won't go into it here. Let's step back and ask what the universe being created means. In Catholic theology, creation refers to the fact that the universe depends for its being upon God. As St. Thomas said, God is to all things the cause of being. Another way to say this is that God is the source of reality or existence. Consider any object, your laptop computer, for example. The fact that it is an actually existing laptop, one that is real rather than merely hypothetical or possible or fictitious, is due to God's conferring being or reality upon it. And this would be so whether it had been in existence for a finite time or an infinite time. An analogy might help understand the difference between beginning and creation. A novel is a sequence of words. The beginning of the novel is just the first words in that sequence. But the source or origin of the novel, the cause of its existence as a work of art, is the mind of the author. If someone asked you why there exists a novel called A Tale of Two Cities, you would not point to its first words, which are, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That would be silly. The reason the novel exists is its author, Charles Dickens, who conceived of it and brought it forth from his mind. In fact, you could imagine a novel that had no beginning, no first words, because its plot went around in a circle. Indeed, it could even be printed on a scroll that loops around. It would have no beginning, but it would still need an author. In the same way, the beginning of the universe is just a set of events that came first in its internal sequence. The source of being of the universe is its divine author. And even if the universe had no beginning, no first events, either because it has an infinite past or because its history goes around in a loop, it would still need an author. This analogy makes another thing clear. Just as the author of a novel is equally the source of every word of the novel, not just its first words, God is equally the source of being of all things and events in the universe throughout all of space and time, not just those at the beginning. That is why in the Creed we say that God is the creator of all things. The fundamental scriptural text about creation is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This tells us both that the universe had a beginning and that it is created by God. But they are distinct components of its meaning. The Catechism of the Catholic Church recognizes this in its discussion of this verse. In section 290, the Catechism says, "Three things are affirmed in these first words of Scripture. The eternal God gave a beginning to all things that exist outside of himself. He alone is the creator, and the totality of what exists, expressed by the formula, the heavens and the earth, depends on the one who gives it being." That is what our faith teaches us. What can modern physics teach us? Nothing about the source of being, for that is not a part of the universe, any more than the author of a novel is part of the novel. And physics studies the universe and its parts. But modern physics may be able to tell us whether the universe had a beginning. By the late 19th century, several scientific discoveries had been made that seemed to suggest that the universe had no beginning. In Newtonian physics, for example, it was natural to assume that time stretched infinitely into both past and future, just as space was assumed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Moreover, physicists discovered the law of conservation of energy, which said that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only changed from one form to another. And chemists discovered that atoms are never created or destroyed in chemical reactions. So it began to appear that matter, energy, space, and time had always existed and always would. In 1911, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Svante Arrhenius said, "The opinion that something can come from nothing is at variance with the present-day state of science, according to which matter is immutable." The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Walter Nernst declared that to deny the infinite duration of time would be to betray the very foundations of science. Of course, it was realized that the Earth must have had a beginning, since it is still hot inside and would have cooled off if it had been infinitely old. And some scientists tried to make analogous arguments that the universe had a beginning. But it was hard to make scientific sense of the idea, and the view began to prevail among scientists that the universe had always existed. To some, the idea of a cosmic beginning came to seem like a relic of religious mythology and contrary to modern science. But a dramatic reversal occurred in the 20th century. Einstein's theory of gravity, called general relativity, was published in 1916. In Einstein's theory, space and time form a four-dimensional manifold, which one can think of as a physical fabric that can bend and ripple in response to the matter and energy filling it. In the 1920s, a Russian mathematician named Alexander Friedmann and a Belgian theoretical physicist named Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest, showed independently of each other that the equations of Einstein's theory could describe a universe that is expanding. That is, not just a universe in which matter is moving apart, but a universe in which space itself is stretching to make the universe larger. Based on his theoretical calculations and on observations by astronomers showing distant galaxies moving away from us, Lemaitre proposed that the universe is indeed expanding from an initial explosion, which he called the primeval atom, and which is now called the Big Bang. In the 1960s, the cosmic radiation left over from that explosion was discovered, and since then, evidence for the Big Bang has accumulated rapidly. There is now no doubt among fundamental physicists and cosmologists that there was a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago. In the standard model of cosmology, the Big Bang is assumed to be the beginning of the universe and thus of matter, space, and time itself. That does not resolve the question definitively, however, as there are many speculative extensions of the standard model of cosmology, and in some of these scenarios, they're not yet testable theories, the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe. Some of the more important scenarios in which the universe had a pre-Big Bang history are called the bouncing universe, the ekpyrotic universe, and eternal inflation. In the bouncing universe scenario, the universe is supposed to be undergoing an endless cycle of expansion and contraction, with each contracting phase ending in a bounce that leads to a new expansion. The Big Bang would merely have been the latest such bounce. In the ekpyrotic universe scenario, our universe is one of two parallel universes that undergo endless cycles in which they crash into each other by moving through a fourth dimension of space and then move apart again. The Big Bang would have been the latest such crash. In the eternal inflation scenario, bubble universes are constantly forming within a larger universe that is perpetually expanding. The Big Bang would have been the formation of our bubble. These scenarios are very interesting, and one of them could turn out to be correct. Nevertheless, there are strong theoretical reasons to think that even in such scenarios, the universe as a whole probably had to have a beginning, either at the Big Bang or earlier. There are two reasons to think this. The more fundamental reason is the second law of thermodynamics. This law says that entropy, a mathematical measure of physical disorder, always increases on the whole, which causes physical systems to run down, wear out, or decay. This is what makes so-called perpetual motion machines impossible. And it is also why our bodies run down and we are destined to undergo physical death. The point is that a universe that has lasted for an infinite time would, in essence, be a perpetual motion machine. The second reason is a theorem proved in 2003 by the physicists Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, which says, roughly speaking, that if one traces the history of an expanding universe backwards in time, one must come either to a beginning of time or to an era where classical concepts of time no longer apply because of quantum mechanical effects. So even though we cannot be certain from the scientific evidence that the universe had a temporal beginning, it nevertheless seems most likely that it did, given everything we know at present. This can be seen as a vindication of Jewish and Christian revelation. The idea of a cosmic beginning was rejected by the pagan philosophers of antiquity as absurd, and by many modern atheists as unscientific, but science now seems strongly to support it. I've asserted that physics cannot tell us whether the universe is created. In recent years, however, some physicists have claimed not only that physics can answer this question, but that physics shows us how the universe can have created itself. More specifically, they say that the universe might have emerged into being through what physicists call a quantum fluctuation. Some call this the quantum creation of the universe. As we will see in a minute, those physicists are not really saying anything at all about creation. All they are really saying, stripped of pseudo-theological language, is two things. First, that the fundamental laws of physics may require the universe to have a finite past, that is, a temporal beginning. And second, that the events or processes that took place at the beginning of the universe may have happened in accordance with those laws of physics. Both of these statements are perfectly reasonable, and neither is in any way in conflict or tension with Catholic belief. That the universe had a temporal beginning is part of Catholic belief, and there is no theological reason whatsoever to suppose that the physical processes that went on at the beginning of the universe in any way contravened the laws of physics. Going back to the analogy of a novel, the laws of physics are to the physical events in the universe somewhat as the laws of grammar are to the words of a novel. Just as one would expect the first sentences of a novel to obey the same grammatical rules as the later sentences, one would expect that the first events of the universe would obey the same physical laws as the later events. And just as the first sentences of a novel obeying the laws of grammar in no way implies that the novel has no author, the first events in the universe obeying the laws of physics in no way implies that the universe has no author. When some physicists say that the laws of physics can create the universe and thereby be an adequate substitute for God, they're making a basic conceptual blunder. They are confusing the roles of the author of the work and the rules of grammar in which the work is composed. One person who made this mistake was Stephen Hawking near the end of his life in a book that he co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow called The Grand Design. There he said that the laws of quantum gravity can create a universe. The refutation of Hawking's mistake is quite simple, and strangely enough, was given by Hawking himself many years earlier. In his 1988 bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Hawking noted that any theory of physics is just a set of rules and equations. And then he went on to ask, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. The question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe is exactly the question of why the universe actually exists, why it is a real entity as opposed to something merely hypothetical, possible, or fictitious. It is the question of the source of being, which is the question of creation. What Hawking was explicitly and correctly pointing out in 1988 is that the laws of physics cannot, even in principle, and that is the word he used, cannot, answer the question of creation. The point Hawking was making in 1988 can perhaps be made clearer by another simple analogy. One may know the rules of a game, let's say baseball. Those rules describe the various kinds of things that can happen in a baseball game. They tell us when they happen, under what circumstances, and in what sequence. They tell us that baseball games must have a beginning and how they end. But here's the crucial point. Those rules can in no way tell us whether any actual game of baseball is being played, has ever been played, or ever will be played. The rules could be describing merely hypothetical or possible or fictitious games. A mere set of rules does not have the power to make real the events they describe. Just as the rules of baseball describe how a baseball game would begin, but do not cause there to be any real baseball games, so too the rules of a possible kind of universe, the mathematical equations that would govern that type of universe, may describe how such a universe would begin, but could not cause there to be a real universe of that type. The laws of physics have no power to create universes in the sense of giving reality to them. So to the question why there is a really existing world for the laws of physics to describe, it makes sense to answer God, as Catholics and other theists do. It also is logically consistent, if problematic, to say, as atheists do, that there is no answer and that the universe just happens to exist for no reason and without any cause. What makes absolutely no sense at all is to say that the laws of physics are the answer. To sum up, our faith teaches us both that the universe had a beginning and that it has a cause of its being. Modern physics seems to confirm the first statement, but cannot, even in principle, say anything about the second.